Somerset Medical Center, New Jersey, 2003. A patient was rushed to the ICU. His condition had been stable just hours earlier, but now his heart was failing for no apparent reason. The doctors scrambled. Medications were administered, chest compressions began, but within minutes, he was gone. The medical team stood in silence. This wasn't the first time this had happened. Patients who weren't supposed to die were dying. No warning, no clear cause, just an abrupt, irreversible end. Then, the toxicology report came back. The patient had a lethal amount of digoxin in his system, a drug that in small doses regulates the heartbeat, but in excess stops the heart completely. The problem? No doctor had prescribed it. Somewhere in the hospital, someone was playing God. And as investigators would later uncover, this wasn't a tragic accident. It was murder. A methodical, invisible form of killing that had been happening for nearly 2 decades. His name? Charles Cullen. A nurse, a caregiver, a serial killer hiding in plain sight. By the time he was caught, he had confessed to killing at least 40 people, but experts believe the real number could be over 400. Making him the most prolific serial killer in American history. And the scariest part? He might have never been caught at all. This is the chilling true story of Charles Cullen, the so-called Angel of Death, who turned hospitals into his personal hunting ground for 16 years, while those around him ignored the warning signs. Before he became America's deadliest nurse, Charles Cullen was just another kid from a troubled home. Born in West Orange, New Jersey in 1960, Cullen was the youngest of 8 children in a working-class family, but his childhood was far from ordinary. It was filled with loss, instability, and quiet suffering. At just 7 years old, he experienced his first tragedy. His father passed away, leaving his mother alone to raise him and his siblings. The house was chaotic, money was tight, and Charles? He was invisible. By the time he reached high school, the darkness inside him had started to show. He was a misfit, withdrawn, awkward, and always staring off into space, lost in his own world. While other kids were planning their futures, Charles was experimenting with death. At just 9 years old, he mixed a deadly chemical cocktail from his school's chemistry set and fed it to his pet dog, just to see what would happen. No remorse, no hesitation. That was his first kill. As a teenager, the warning signs became clearer. He attempted suicide multiple times, once by drinking chemicals, another time by stabbing himself with a knife. Each time, he survived. But instead of getting help, he grew colder. Then, at 17, another blow. His mother, the only person he truly cared about, died in a car accident. The hospital where she was taken cremated her body before he could even say goodbye. This was his breaking point. He dropped out of school and enlisted in the U.S. Navy, hoping for structure, discipline, and maybe a way to escape his pain. But instead of finding purpose, he found another place to hide his darkness. After his mother's sudden death, Cullen had no real direction. The Navy didn't work out. Nursing school gave him structure, but beneath the surface, his mind was already set on something far more sinister. But for Cullen, it was the perfect cover. In 1987, he graduated and took his first job at St. Barnabas Medical Center in New Jersey. It didn't take long for the deaths to begin. His first known victim was a 72-year-old judge admitted for a routine procedure. His condition was stable, recovery looked promising. But, under Cullen's care, the judge was given a lethal overdose of insulin, causing his blood sugar to plummet. Within hours, he was dead. There was no investigation, no suspicion, just another unfortunate hospital death. And that's when Cullen realized something chilling. He could kill, and no one would stop him. Over the next 2 years, he experimented with different drugs, looking for the perfect way to kill without leaving a trace. Insulin, digoxin, epinephrine, each one could turn a routine hospital stay into a sudden, unexplained death. But when a hospital pharmacist noticed vials of medication disappearing, Cullen suddenly resigned before any questions could be asked. That should have been the end. That should have been the moment someone stopped him. But instead, Cullen moved to a new hospital and the body count continued to rise. Because as one hospital let him go, another one welcomed him in, without asking why he left. And the cycle repeated, again and again. At St. Barnabas Medical Center, Charles Cullen had already claimed multiple lives. But when hospital officials noticed missing medication and unexplained deaths, they didn't launch an investigation. They didn't contact the police. Instead, they simply allowed him to resign quietly. And just like that, Cullen walked away, without a stain on his record. That should have been the moment his crimes ended. Instead, it was just the beginning. Days later, he was working at Warren Hospital, and almost immediately, patients started dying mysteriously once again. An elderly woman recovering from surgery suddenly coded in the middle of the night. Before losing consciousness, she told her daughter that a nurse had injected something into her IV. That nurse was Charles Cullen. The hospital administration was aware of irregularities in the medication logs, but instead of alerting the authorities, they let him go. This became a pattern that would continue for 16 years. Each time a hospital grew suspicious, they chose to protect their reputation instead of protecting their patients. Cullen was never fired for malpractice. He was never formally reported. He simply moved on to the next hospital where he was hired with no questions asked. He exploited a broken system, one where hospitals feared lawsuits more than they feared a murderer working in their hallways. 9 hospitals, dozens of unexplained deaths, no one connecting the dots. Cullen wasn't a criminal mastermind. He wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was working in plain sight, slipping unnoticed through one of the most trusted institutions in society. And he might have continued indefinitely, if not for one nurse at one hospital who finally decided enough was enough. By the time Charles Cullen arrived at Somerset Medical Center in New Jersey in 2002, he had already left behind a trail of unexplained deaths. But just like before, no one questioned his past. No one asked why he had worked at so many hospitals in such a short time. And once again, patients who should have been recovering were suddenly dying. But this time, someone was watching. A nurse named Amy Logren had worked alongside Cullen in the intensive care unit. She had no reason to suspect him at first. He was quiet, professional, and even friendly toward her. But then she noticed something strange. Patients under Cullen's care were dying unexpectedly. A perfectly stable patient would crash out of nowhere, and despite emergency efforts, they wouldn't survive. There was no clear medical explanation until she checked the hospital's records. What she found stopped her cold. Cullen had been accessing patient files, even those who weren't assigned to him. He was also ordering and administering drugs in doses that made no sense. Some of these drugs were highly dangerous, capable of causing sudden cardiac arrest if misused. At first, Amy Logren didn't want to believe it. She had worked with Cullen, laughed with him, trusted him. But the numbers on the screen didn't lie. Patient after patient, their vitals fine 1 minute, gone the next. And always, Charles Cullen was there. She took her concerns to hospital officials. But instead of taking immediate action, they hesitated. They wanted to handle the situation internally, just like every other hospital before them. But then, one night in October 2003, a healthy patient coded and died suddenly. Toxicology reports later revealed a deadly dose of digoxin, a heart medication that, in excess, can cause fatal arrhythmias. The hospital knew they could no longer ignore the evidence. They finally contacted authorities. But there was a problem. Without solid proof, police couldn't arrest Cullen. They needed a confession. And there was only one person who could get it: Amy Logren. She agreed to wear a wire and meet Cullen in a restaurant. She played along as if she wasn't suspicious, asking him casual questions about the deaths at Somerset. Then, he said something chilling. He didn't deny it. He admitted to helping people die. It was enough. Hours later, police arrested Charles Cullen at his home, but even after his arrest, one terrifying question remained. How many had he really killed? On December 12, 2003, police officers arrived at Charles Cullen's home. They knocked on his door, but he didn't seem surprised. He barely resisted as they placed him in handcuffs and led him away. At the police station, detectives were ready for a fight. They expected denial, resistance, maybe even a demand for a lawyer. But when they sat across from Cullen in the interrogation room, something unexpected happened. He talked. Not only did he confess, but he did so without hesitation. In a calm, detached voice, he admitted to killing at least 40 people. "I gave them what they needed," he said. To the investigators, it sounded like he believed he was helping his victims. He described injecting patients with deadly doses of digoxin, insulin, and other drugs, often targeting those who were sick but not terminally ill. But then, detectives pressed him. 40 murders, that number didn't seem right. They knew it had to be more. "How many do you think you actually killed?" they asked. Cullen shrugged. "I wouldn't even know. Maybe 100, maybe more." That moment sent a chill through the room. Unlike most serial killers, Cullen wasn't keeping a trophy count. There was no method to his selection, no pattern beyond the fact that he could kill and no one was stopping him. But the real horror came when forensic investigators reviewed his hospital records. They uncovered years' worth of suspicious patient deaths, people who had died unexpectedly while under his care. Some experts believe the real number could be over 400. If true, that would make Charles Cullen the most prolific serial killer in American history. But the justice system could only work with what they could prove. He was charged with 29 confirmed murders, though everyone knew that was only a fraction of his real body count. In 2006, Cullen pleaded guilty to all charges. He was sentenced to 11 consecutive life sentences, without the possibility of parole. In court, the families of his victims watched as he refused to explain why he had done it. He showed no remorse, no emotion, just blank indifference. But even as he was led away in chains, one final question remained unanswered. How many others like him might still be out there, working in hospitals right now, unnoticed, undetected? When Charles Cullen was finally locked away, many believed the nightmare was over. He had been sentenced to multiple life terms, ensuring he would never be free again. But his crimes had revealed a disturbing truth. He wasn't just a murderer, he was a symptom of a much deeper failure within the healthcare system. Cullen had been able to kill for nearly 2 decades, moving between hospitals without consequence. Despite multiple warning signs, not a single hospital had formally reported him to law enforcement. Instead, they allowed him to resign quietly, sweeping their concerns under the rug and passing the danger onto another hospital. The most alarming revelation came during the investigation. At least one hospital, Somerset Medical Center, had concrete suspicions about Cullen. Administrators had already gathered evidence that he was ordering unauthorized medications. Yet they delayed reporting him to the police for months. Why? Because they feared a lawsuit. A wrongful accusation, they believed, could damage the hospital's reputation. But that delay cost more lives. The realization that hospitals were more concerned with public image than patient safety led to a national outcry. In the wake of Cullen's crimes, lawmakers were forced to confront glaring loopholes in hospital regulations. Several new laws were introduced to prevent another case like his. Hospitals are now required to report suspicious medical professionals to state authorities, making it harder for them to simply move to another facility unnoticed. Prescription monitoring systems were strengthened, ensuring that drugs like digoxin and insulin could no longer be accessed so easily without oversight. And perhaps most importantly, background checks on medical staff became more rigorous, preventing someone with a history of questionable behavior from slipping through the cracks. These reforms closed some of the loopholes that had allowed Cullen to operate freely, but they came too late for his victims. And even with these safeguards in place, one chilling question remains. If Charles Cullen, a man with a history of mental instability, multiple firings, and unexplained patient deaths, could evade detection for so long, how many others like him might still be out there? Do these new laws make hospitals safer, or is there still a risk of another Charles Cullen? Let us know your thoughts in the comments.